For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. Hiking in rugged terrain is joy laced with danger. The joy comes first, the sting of cold air in your lungs, the thunder of rivers boiling down granite, the stillness of alpine meadows where silence feels like prayer. But the danger is never far behind. The same rocks that lift you skyward can shift under your boots and break you in an instant. A single misstep, a single moment of carelessness, and the mountain will take its price. It doesn't matter how strong you are, how long you've trained, or how badly someone waits for you at home. The wilderness is beautiful, but it will not care if you live or die. Let's venture back to the savage wilderness where survival is earned, not given. This is Outdoor Disasters. For Gregg Hein, his Mount Goddard hike would be a disaster. Gregg Hein wasn't a stranger to the wilderness. He had grown up in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada, where granite spires rise from pine valleys and snowmelt streams roar down polished canyons. For the Heins, the Sierra wasn't just a place on a map, it was home ground. By his early 30s, Hein had become a seasoned mountaineer and backpacker, someone who felt more at ease in the wilderness than in city streets. He was lean and strong, with the wiry endurance of someone who carried packs over countless ridgelines. But he was also independent, maybe too independent. He liked moving light and fast, trusting his own judgment. Going solo didn't scare him. In fact, it appealed to him. Gregg Hein didn't consider himself much of a peak bagger. He had logged plenty of trail miles in the past, but the last 2 years had been quiet, consumed by work and school. Now, with his bachelor's degree finally behind him, he felt the pull of the mountains again. It was time to reconnect. He planned a 3 to 4 day loop that would take him over 13,563-foot Mount Goddard in Kings Canyon National Park, a journey that would begin and end with a soak in Blaney Hot Springs. Before leaving on Thursday, he told his father where he was headed and that he expected to be back by Monday. Hein had been hiking alone for 15 years. Solitude on the trail was familiar territory, and the solitude of the Sierra was part of the draw. On solo climbs, he could set his own pace, linger on a summit, or change a route without debate. It was a dance between man and mountain, no one else in the way. So when he set his sights on Mount Goddard in July 2014, it didn't strike him as dangerous. The peak sat in the deep heart of Kings Canyon National Park, miles from trailheads. On the evening of July 3rd, he left the Florence Lake trailhead under a purple twilight sky. Other hikers were heading out, bound for cabins or cars, but Gregg was just beginning. He hit the trail at 8:20 p.m. The air was still, the night cool. He moved quickly, the way experienced hikers do. The wilderness embraced him. By dawn, he would be deep in the Sierra, alone on a path few people walked. He was confident. He was prepared. What he couldn't know was that in less than 24 hours, one slip of stone would test everything he had ever learned about the mountains and about himself. Kings Canyon National Park is not a place that gives itself up easily. Tucked into the Sierra Nevada of California, it is a land of stone walls and silent valleys, where glaciers carved deep scars into granite and left behind a wilderness both beautiful and brutal. To step into Kings Canyon is to step into the marrow of the mountains, steep, remote, and uncompromising. Unlike its neighbor Yosemite with its tour buses and camera flashes, Kings Canyon demands more from those who enter. The trails are longer, the climbs steeper, the distance is vast. It is a place where you measure progress not in miles but in ridges crossed, streams forded and switchbacks endured. The rivers run cold and fast here, fed by snowmelt that lingers well into summer. The air is thin, clean, and carries the scent of lodgepole pine. At its heart is the canyon itself, one of the deepest in North America, more than 8,000 feet from rim to river. Sheer granite walls rise like fortresses, dwarfing the forests below. Beyond the canyon stretch hundreds of square miles of backcountry, where trails fade into talus slopes and high passes, lead to lonely basins studded with turquoise lakes. It is a place that humbles even the experienced. The granite is beautiful but unforgiving, A single loose stone can shift, and in an instant, the mountains remind you of their indifference. To walk here is to walk in a landscape that has not bent itself to humanity. It is one of the last true wilderness strongholds of the Sierra Nevada, a place where survival is not assumed, but earned. On Friday morning, Hein soaked briefly at Blaney Hot Springs before pressing toward Goddard's hulking mass. The summit came easily by late morning, clear skies opening into the sweep of Kings Canyon National Park. Hein stood on the summit of Mount Goddard. The peak was one of the great sentinels of Kings Canyon, less famous than neighboring peaks like the Palisades or Whitney, but no less commanding. From its granite crown, he could see ridge after ridge fading into blue distance. The Black Divide to the west, Evolution Valley and Darwin Canyon to the north, and the jagged white teeth of the High Sierra stretching endlessly beyond. The air was sharp, crystalline, so clean it seemed to cut through him. For a moment, Hein stood there breathing it in. This was what he had come for. The silence, the feeling of standing above the world, the sense that after years of school and work, he was once again where he belonged. But summits, as every mountaineer knows, are only half the journey. The real danger comes on the way down. Hein had reached the top by a route that was long but safe. Now he studied the terrain below, weighing options. His plan was to head off trail toward Evolution Basin. South of Goddard Divide, the terrain broke into a vast boulder field, and side-hilling across it looked treacherous. Instead, he worked his way along the ridge, searching for a couloir that might give him a more direct descent. He scrambled down into the bottom of a gully, stopping at a narrow choke just above a snowfield. As he reached for a handhold, his palm closed around a loose stone. It came free in his hand. He tried to wedge it back beneath a larger rock, but it wouldn't stay. That's when he saw the boulder shift. It was a monster, 2 feet across, 150 pounds or 70 kilos. It slid, rotated, and before he could move, it crashed onto his right calf. The impact snapped his tibia above the ankle, sending him tumbling into the steep snow chute below. He landed upright, his pack cushioning him as he shot downslope. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a trail of blood marking the snow behind him. The snowfield had sun pockets, and my right foot went into one. Like a fish out of water, my ankle started flapping, and the bones ground on each other. All this extra blood came out. I hit another sun pocket. It was the most intense pain I ever felt, but I couldn't dwell on it. I was rocketing down the snowfield and needed to self-arrest before I racked myself on some exposed rocks that were coming up. I dug my left heel and palm into the snow, and it was enough. When I looked down, it was gruesome, Gregg recalled. He lay there gasping, every nerve on fire. When he dared to look, he saw the truth. His tibia jutted 3 or 4 inches out of the torn flesh above his right ankle, and it was only the beginning. In that frozen moment, the world narrowed. The grandeur of the Sierra disappeared. The sky, the mountains, the ridges, all shrank to the savage reality of a single wound. Gregg Hein was 10 miles from the nearest trailhead, alone, with a compound fracture that could bleed him out or kill him with infection. The summit had been glorious. The descent had become a nightmare, one that left him stranded in the heart of the Sierra, broken on the mountainside with nothing but his wits and a few scraps of gear standing between him and death. The first seconds after the fall were chaos. Pain roared through Gregg Hein's leg, so intense it seemed to blot out the world. For a few moments, shock threatened to take him under, the kind of blank nothingness that whispers surrender. But then training, years of experience in the backcountry, forced its way to the surface. If he panicked, he would die. He needed to act. He dragged himself off the snow and onto a patch of broken moraine, where at least the cold wouldn't seep into him as quickly. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his ruined leg, but Hein knew he couldn't afford to lie in the snow bleeding and shaking. Exposure could kill him as surely as the fracture. From his pack, Hein pulled out the tools that would become his lifeline. His trekking poles became rigid splints, lashed against the leg with his belt and lengths of nylon webbing. He cut a section from his foam sleeping pad to cushion the splint, layering it against the jagged bone. A pair of long johns, once destined for cold nights, was torn into strips and wrapped tightly around the wound to add pressure. The process was brutal. Every twist of fabric sent lightning through his nerves, sweat beading on his face, but he pressed on. When the splint was secure, he turned to shelter. There was no chance he could crawl to safety, burdened with all his gear. He made a hard choice. He left his food behind, reasoning that he wouldn't starve before rescuers arrived, and instead pulled out only the items that might keep him alive in the short term. Into his arms went the bivy sack, poncho, a Leatherman multi-tool, a balaclava, a beanie, and a whistle. Cannibalized from his pack's sternum strap and tied to his shirt's top buttonhole with a piece of string. He kept the multi-tool close because in the darkest corner of his mind, he considered the possibility of using its blade to cut off the ruined leg if things got worse. Then, dragging himself inch by inch, Hein crawled roughly 100 yards to the edge of a moraine. There he found a sheltered ledge with a clear view of the valley, a place where he could hunker down and signal for help when the time came. He settled in, remarkably calm given the circumstances. He had transformed himself from a man in shock into a patient stabilized on a mountainside. And yet the reality hung over him like a storm cloud. He was still 10 miles from the nearest trailhead, utterly alone, with a compound fracture that could bleed him dry or rot his leg with infection. But for now, he had done the one thing survival demanded. He had bought himself time. The mountains around him were silent, indifferent. The couloir he had fallen through towered above, granite walls catching the late afternoon light. Below him stretched the snowfield, streaked with the thin red trail of his blood. Kings Canyon had taken its price. Gregg Hein lay back in his bivvy, trembling, listening to his own breath. The pain was monstrous, but the work was done. He had splinted the leg. He had made shelter. He had kept himself alive for another hour. Now came the waiting. By the next day, he could smell the stench of blood, believing infection was settling in. I crawled over to the nearest snow patch. Using a rock shaped like an adze, I scraped off the top layer of snow and used ice crystals to scour the wound. I then filled it with snow to flush it out. The infection made the wound sticky, so when it started to ooze out, it would glob on the bone. I dipped the blade in there and pulled the goop out. I massaged my foot, ankle, and calf and tried to keep my toes moving to maintain blood flow. This and the wound cleanings became my routine for the next 3 days. I knew rescuers would be looking for me when I didn't check in on Monday, so I stayed calm and busy, he recalled. By the third day, Hein had begun to understand the rhythm of survival. He wasn't thriving, not by any stretch, but he had settled into a routine. Grim, uncomfortable, but necessary. Each morning began with the same ritual. Check the wound, clear away any new filth, repack it with snow to slow infection. The sight never got easier. The exposed bone, the swollen flesh around it, it was grotesque. And each time he peeled back the makeshift bandage, his stomach lurched. But if he ignored it, the leg would rot, and then there would be no hope. He was weak now. The accident had burned through the calories he had brought, and his food was gone. He had made a choice early on to leave most of it behind when he crawled to the moraine. At the time, he figured he could last several days without eating if rescue came soon, but rescue had not come. Hunger gnawed at him, hollow and relentless, every hour sharper than the last. The days blurred together in repetition. Melt snow, drink water, blow the whistle, wave the yellow bivy sack, rest, tend the wound, repeat. At times he thought he heard helicopters. The thrum of rotors echoed faintly through the canyons, only to fade away. Were they real? Or the hallucinations of a starving, feverish mind? The sun beat down during the afternoons, baking him in his bivvy. Then, as soon as it dipped behind the peaks, the cold slammed back. Luckily, it never got colder than 40 or 4 degrees Celsius. But still, the nights were cruel, long hours of shivering in the thin air, listening to the wind cut across the rocks. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by pain or by dreams of food. Thick sandwiches, cold sodas, hot coffee. He would wake, lips cracked, belly empty, the dream dissolving into the same indifferent granite walls. By the fourth day, the fight to stay rational grew harder. His mind wandered. He thought of his family, his father, who knew where he was supposed to be, who would surely have raised the alarm by now. The snow kept him hydrated, the splint held, though his leg throbbed constantly. But every hour that passed made one fact clearer. He could not count on rescue finding him here. Something would have to change. By the end of the fourth day, Hein lay awake in the darkness, heart pounding, fever creeping higher. His body was weakening, but his mind reached a hard decision. Tomorrow, if no one came, he would move, he would crawl, because waiting alone on that slope was starting to feel like waiting for death. That morning, he knew the waiting game was over. The helicopters hadn't come. If rescue was looking, they hadn't found him. Lying on the slope, he stared toward the basin below, where Davis Lake gleamed between granite walls. It was a mile and a half away, an impossible distance under the circumstances, but also the only chance he had. The open terrain by the lake might give him better visibility to be spotted from the air. Staying put meant surrender. Moving, however painful, meant hope. He tore strips from his gear to fashion a crude sling that would keep his ruined leg stretched straight. Then, bracing on his elbows and one good leg, he began to crawl. Not a clean crawl, but a series of desperate scoots and drags, his body jolting forward in fits. He set small goals, 20 scoots, then a pause, 20 more. Each push sent spikes of pain radiating through his fractured bones, but he counted them off like prayers, a rhythm to drown out the screaming nerves. The Sierra didn't make it easy. The moraine was uneven, strewn with sharp rocks that tore at his hands and elbows. The snowfields offered brief relief, smooth sliding, but each time his body lurched across a pocket of softer snow, the leg jolted, and the grinding of bone on bone brought white-hot flashes of agony. At one point, he let out a guttural cry that echoed back from the cliffs, startling even himself. But still he pushed on. Halfway between the last boulder field and Davis Lake, he noticed a cricket leap across his path. He thought briefly about eating it, though hunger wasn't gnawing at him the way he expected. When a second cricket appeared, he reached out almost lazily, making a half-hearted stab, and to his surprise, caught it. He knew enough to pull off the hind legs and wings so they wouldn't catch in his throat, then popped it into his mouth. To his astonishment, it didn't taste bad. From then on, anything slow enough to grab became food. He ate 2 crickets, 5 or 6 moths, 8 or 10 large ants, and 3 or 4 water bugs. Each tiny mouthful gave him just enough strength to keep going. The crawl was brutal. 1.6 miles or 2.5 kilometers in 4 hours. But by sheer determination, he made it to the shores of Davis Lake. There he found a sheltered pocket of ground, just wide enough for his shoulders and just long enough for his body. It was not comfort, but it was survival, and for the moment, that was enough. On the 6th morning, Gregg Hein stirred from a fevered sleep to the same bleak silence of the Sierra. His body was at its edge. The wound smelled foul, his lips were split from thirst, and even the insects he had been chasing no longer seemed to stir. He had moved as far as he could, 1.6 miles of crawling, dragging himself toward Davis Lake, and now he lay in a narrow hollow, just big enough for his body. But that morning, something shifted. A sound carried faintly through the granite canyons, too mechanical to be wind. Hein froze, heart pounding. Then it grew louder, the unmistakable thump of rotors. A helicopter. Adrenaline surged through him. He clawed for his bivy sack, the bright yellow nylon he had counted on for days, and spread it wide across the rock. He waved it with frantic strength, blew on the whistle tied to his shirt, screamed until his voice cracked. The helicopter passed overhead, its shadow sliding across the basin, then dwindled into silence. The disappointment was crushing. He lay back, chest heaving, eyes wet with frustration. But the sound returned minutes later. Again he waved, again he blew the whistle until his lungs burned. Again the aircraft banked away. This happened 5, maybe 6 times. Each pass raised hope, only to dash it again. Hein began to feel he was trapped in some cruel game, a ghost waving frantically while the living world flew past, blind to his existence. On the last pass he caught a glimmer of connection. Through the cockpit window, he thought he saw the pilot's head turn, saw a flicker of recognition. The helicopter banked sharply, coming lower. Hein raised the bivy sack high, shaking it with every ounce of strength left in his arms. The machine circled once, then hovered, dust and grit whipping into the air. This time, they had seen him. When the rescuers reached him, Hein tried to protest as they brought out a stretcher. Stubborn to the end, he insisted he could crawl the last distance himself. They ignored him, gently but firmly lifting him into the stretcher and securing him for the flight out. His ordeal was over. As the helicopter rose and the jagged walls of Kings Canyon fell away beneath him, Hein looked down one last time at the basin that had nearly taken his life. 6 days of pain, hunger, insects, snow, and silence ended in the roar of rotor blades. Relief flooded through him, heavy and overwhelming, leaving him lightheaded. For the first time since the boulder had crushed his leg, he allowed himself to believe he would live. The helicopter carried Gregg out of the deep heart of Kings Canyon and touched down at the hospital in Fresno. Doctors and nurses swarmed the stretcher. They were shocked by what they saw. 6 days with an open fracture was nearly unheard of. By all rights, Hein should have been dead from blood loss or septic infection. His leg was grotesquely swollen, the tibia still protruding at a ghastly angle, the wound caked with dirt and dried blood. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, his frame gaunt from starvation, and yet he was conscious, alert, and calm in a way that startled even the trauma team. Hein was rushed into surgery almost immediately. The first priority was to clean the wound. Hours of careful debridement to remove dirt, dead tissue, and the beginnings of infection. Then came the reconstruction. Surgeons aligned the broken tibia, inserted plates and screws to hold the bone, and stitched torn muscles back together. The procedure was grueling, but when it was over, the leg was saved. Against every expectation, amputation had been avoided. Recovery was not swift. He spent weeks in the hospital, battling pain, fevers, and the lingering risk of infection. Multiple follow-up surgeries were needed to stabilize the leg. For days at a time, he lay in a hospital bed, immobile, staring at white walls after staring at granite for nearly a week. Doctors told him plainly, his improvisation, splinting with trekking poles, cleaning with snow, forcing circulation in his foot, had been the difference between survival and death. In interviews later, Hein would downplay his suffering. He told his story plainly, without embellishment, as though it were just another trip that had gone wrong. But those closest to him could see the shadow it left. The Sierra had tested him in the most brutal way imaginable, and though he had survived, he carried the scars, both visible and invisible. When recalling his ordeal, Gregg expressed his gratitude to his family and the search and rescue for his recovery, stating, "It was quite the relief to be saved, not only for my loved ones and family, but also for the search and rescue workers who put in a lot of energy and effort and extreme hours into the search and rescue. It was really important to me to get them out of there as soon as possible because the longer they're there, the greater chance that one of them could get injured. So a quick resolution to any search and rescue is always preferable. Because of that, I can't commend them enough for the effort and the energy they put out to try to save one person's life." The mountains are beautiful, but they do not forgive. Every step is a gift, and every mistake is a debt the wilderness will collect. And those who forget that truth do not return. Beauty brings you to the mountains. Indifference keeps you there. Respect is the only thing that lets you walk out alive. You may love the wild, but the wild does not love you. It only waits. When you falter, it takes. And when it does, the mountains will not remember your name. They will only remember your bones. If you find yourself with an injured leg alone in the wilderness, miles from safety, you must first stabilize the injury, stop the bleeding, immobilize the injury, and buy yourself time. A trekking pole or a piece of wood can be helpful as a splint to keep the leg together. Shelter is priority. Hypothermia and exposure kill faster than thirst or hunger. Use a bivy sack, tarp, space blanket, or even natural shelters like caves, overhangs, or pine boughs. Conserve body heat by insulating from the ground. Pine needles, leaves, or your backpack can help. Humans can last weeks without food, but only days without water. Collect rain, melt snow, or filter or boil stream water if possible. If you can't purify, choose running water over stagnant pools. Bright colors, reflective gear, or laid-out patterns of rocks or logs can catch attention. 3 whistle blasts, 3 shouts, or 3 fires is the universal distress signal. If you have a mirror, phone screen, or metal surface, use it to flash sunlight. If rescue is likely, stay put. It's easier for teams to find you. If you must move, go slowly, conserve energy, and aim for open areas or ridgelines where you're more visible. Mark your path with branches, stacked stones, or notes if you leave camp. Clean wounds with the cleanest water you can find, even if untreated. Leave deep wounds open to drain rather than sealing in bacteria. Gently move your fingers or toes to maintain circulation if possible. Create a routine, check injuries, collect water, signal, rest. Remember that staying calm conserves energy and oxygen. Panic wastes both. Above all, refuse to quit because that's what it takes out here. Not bravado, not recklessness, but grit. The ability to endure pain, fight despair, and cling to life even when the odds are stacked against you. And only those who remember this can make it through their outdoor disaster. If you've made it this far, please consider clicking those subscribe and like buttons. Want more outdoor disasters content? Check out these videos I believe you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching.